Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome to my analysis of the swords in the World of Warcraft movie. Now, I'm fully aware, having seen the movie, that it has a lot of problems, but out of any other medieval fantasy property and movie that I've seen, World of Warcraft has a very interesting take on this theme. Specifically, its fantasy side is emphasized far more, in comparison to, say, Lord of the Rings, where in Lord of the Rings they wanted to make it as realistic and grounded as possible, and so they had very realistic swords in it, as well as the armor, and really everything else, all the set pieces and stuff like that, whereas World of Warcraft, this had a different take. And so in regards to the visual aspect, just looking at the visual aspect alone, I feel they did a really good job, because this movie was based off a video game, and in the video game there is a very strong stylized aspect to everything you see, and so it was important for this movie to have the same stylized feel. And I personally feel in this regard they did a wonderful job. The movie has a very distinct World of Warcraft feel to it. And the other reason why I really want to have a close look at the swords in World of Warcraft is because I feel this is an excellent case study of the balance between realism and fantasy. And in the fantasy genre, the creators have every right to sacrifice certain realistic elements for the rule of cool. The trick is the balance. When does it go too far to the point that it becomes ridiculous or silly? And I think one of the first things that determine this is really just like the overall feel, like in Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, where this is very grounded in realism as much as they can, especially in a visual sense. It wouldn't make sense for Aragorn to be swinging around a sword that is twice as big as himself. But say in Final Fantasy with Cloud's Buster Sword, well, there are so many fantastical elements that just because of the feel of this whole kind of movie or video game, we are willing to make far more concessions in regards to what we know is actually practical and realistic than we are for other types of movies or video games. And so with World of Warcraft, we see this incredibly stylized world. And yes, it's a medieval-ish kind of world, but in regards to the costumes and really all the weapons, they're stylized enough that for me, I can kind of say, okay, this is this kind of fantasy, which is perfectly fine. I feel there is very much a place for fantasy properties like the World of Warcraft movie. Apart from plot and everything, I'm really just talking about the visual side, alright? I feel there is very much a place in the world for these kind of fantasies. Now, having said all that and establishing everything that I just established, does that mean that I think the swords are good? No, I don't. There are still some very big problems with the swords, even with accepting many large fantasy kind of elements. So let's look at them and see what is wrong here. Now, some of you might be thinking that the first big problem with these swords are their size. Well, for me, that's not an issue at all. This is one of those fantasy things that I'm more than happy to make a concession on because it's fantasy. First of all, have a look at the sword sizes in the actual World of Warcraft game. They're massive, okay? And so to accurately convey the visual style of the game, I feel the swords, they do need a match in the movie. You see, being a fantasy in the way that the World of Warcraft is, there's kind of like an unspoken rule that all the characters, all the heroes in this world are super heroic and they possess superhuman abilities, and one of those abilities seems to be the ability to swing around these incredibly oversized and impractical swords. Why? Because really big swords are just cool! It's cool in Final Fantasy, it's cool in certain swords in the Dark Souls series, it's cool in Dragon's Dogma, it's cool in Skyrim, it's cool in Dragon Age. Sometimes we just like really big swords. I think another reason why World of Warcraft gets away in terms this movie succeeds in having ridiculously unrealistic swords in it, whereas Lord of the Rings probably wouldn't have, but it could have if it did the same thing as what I feel World of Warcraft has done here, is that there are no other styled swords in it. What I'm saying here, there's no realistic actual practical looking swords anywhere else in the movie. They all have this size and style to them, and that sets a precedence throughout the entire movie. And indeed, because of that, a properly proportioned longsword would look very out of place in this world. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, where you see many properly proportioned longswords in it, then seeing an oversized sword comparable to the ones that we see in World of Warcraft, that would seem incredibly out of place and just ridiculous. But if all the swords in Lord of the Rings were of a very large and practical size, and that was the theme or style that they were establishing, then it would just make much more sense. If both styles existed in the same world, you would then need an in-world explanation to explain why there are these ridiculously impractical oversized swords in comparison to the properly proportioned and usable functional swords that they also had. And the way that they could do that is a number of things. Well, these swords are made out of mithril, and the metal is 5 times lighter than regular steel, so they make them way bigger to add more cutting potential. Or they have a magical enchantment that makes them feel lighter and usable in the hand. So it is doable, you would just then need to explain it for the audience. Another reason why I feel it's important for these swords to be large is because of what the heroes fight in the movie. Look at the size of those orcs. And that's not even looking at the other monsters in the World of Warcraft mythos, like dragons and things like that. There are some big beasties that you'll face in this world, so swords, just in a practical kind of sense, need to be far bigger to be able to handle them. And even though no human would have the strength to be able to use these swords effectively, what you need to pause and consider is if a person could. So let's just say, if a person could actually swing these swords around as easily as they are shown in the movie, can you imagine then the devastating cutting power that these swords would have just because of their weight? It would be amazing. These swords would just be absolutely monstrous in their damage potential. And so, like I said, not only do I not have a problem with this, I would have actually made the exact same visual choice. The swords need to be big in this movie to convey that same visual style. It's almost a necessity. So I don't have an issue with the size of these swords at all. The issue that I have is with their weight distribution. And you might be thinking, well, hang on, size is related to weight distribution. Well, yes and no. It's their weight distribution at their current size. The biggest offender in regards to the issues that I have with these swords' weight distribution is the Sword of the Royal Guard. Now, this is a very beautiful sword, but if you're familiar with proper sword design, you'll see some big, strange oddities in it. Specifically at the guard. The guard is very, very fat and thick, and then you have this big stylized lion head. Now, if these two parts alone were solid steel, and we can assume that they are, that part alone would weigh almost as much as the whole rest of the sword. There's such a huge amount of unnecessary weight there. And it would make this sword incredibly unwieldy. And you're saying, well, hang on, it's already really big and unwieldy. But even when you have a really big sword, there are things that you can do to make it more usable. And the size of this lion head is absolutely unnecessary. You can make it far more practical while still having it look just as cool. So the first thing that we would want to do, if we were to fix this sword, alright, make it as good as it could be, still keeping the aesthetic style of World of Warcraft, first we shrink that lion's head. We really make that smaller. The next part is we make the guard smaller as well. It's too thick, way too thick. It still looks just as good, but now it's far more practical. And of course, we've lengthened it as well to give it a more effective guard. And now this sword is looking pretty good. In fact, it's looking quite realistic. I would almost say it's looking a bit too realistic now, because this is World of Warcraft. We need big swords. So the next thing, let's make the blade even bigger. Now, if you're thinking that this is too big, well, what's interesting about this, now the Sword of the Royal Guard is actually in about the same size as the sword of King Lane, because the King's sword is very, very beasty and big. And now the Sword of the Royal Guard is at the comparable and, in my opinion, appropriate size as to what it should have been. The other problem that really stands out with this sword, apart from the problems at the hilt, is the depth of the sword blade. It looks so thick, so it's looking around maybe 2 centimeters deep. Now, you can still have it big in terms of length and width, but that depth, my goodness! It is so unnecessary. If you gave this blade a depth of, say, around 5-6 millimeters at the hilt, and then maybe 2-3 millimeters towards the end, it would be just as beastly as before, but so much more usable. We would still have the overly impractical fantasy size of it, but it would just be that little bit better. And with those problems fixed up, it looks so much better, don't you think? I think it does. Looking at the King's Sword, there are far less problems with this sword than there was on the Sword of the Royal Guard. There is nowhere near as much unnecessary weight that travels down the beginning of the bottom part of the blade, but still, there is a lot of unnecessary weight. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, that's just hypocritical. If you're accepting the unnecessary weight of the sheer size, why are you then having a problem with the unnecessary weight that is shown on the hilt? Well, it's a simple matter of balance, alright? With the concessions that you make for the rule of cool, it doesn't mean that you can make concessions on everything. Try and regard it in the same way as people in this world would regard it. Okay, they have the strength to wield really, really big oversized swords. But for them, they would still want the sword to be as practical and usable as they could. And so again, looking at the unnecessary weight of the guard, it's very easy to reduce this. All you need to do is make it a bit thinner in terms of its depth. I can't really show that on a static 2D image, but if you could imagine that this guard was actually much thinner, that would make it far more practical. The next thing, increase the size of the pommel for a decent counterbalance to give more control over the blade. And that's all you'd really need to do for this sword. And even with just the increased size of the pommel, it looks so much better, don't you think? So there you go, these were some of the problems that I've seen in the Swords of the World of Warcraft movie. There weren't nearly as many problems as you might think, because again, I feel there is very much a place for this style of fantasy in the world. It's just where you place that ratio between how much fantasy do you want this, and how much realism and medievalism do you want in this property, movie, or video game. And those movies that have a larger balance of fantasy elements than medieval style elements certainly have the freedom to make concessions on realism for the rule of cool. I think we as medieval enthusiasts need to acknowledge that. The times when I, and I'm sure many of you, have an issue with, is when the movie is trying to proclaim or imply that it has a strong medieval theme or focus in it, especially if it's based in a historical period, and then gets so many things wrong in terms of realism and practicality. Thank you for watching, I hope you have enjoyed, and until next time, farewell. If you would like to support Shadowversity, or express appreciation for a video that you particularly enjoyed, please become a patron through Patreon. Your $1 donation would be absolutely wonderful.